Now, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving up your time to come to this impact session. But as Sophie said, more importantly, just a huge thank you for all of the time that you give to volunteering. We know how valuable your time is, and working in the impact team, we really do see the difference, in our data and our evidence that we're gathering, that you're making every day to the children that you support. So as Sophie said, I'm Lisa. I'm the Head of Impact and Evaluation at Bookmark. I'll be taking you through today's session. I'm also joined by my colleague Chenge, who has played a really leading role in our children's voice research. And so she'll be sharing some of the insights with you today as well. So today's session is all about understanding our impact from the perspectives of the children on our programme. We're really excited to share with you today how we've gathered this data from our children's voices, some of the insights and things that we've learned across the programme and into children's experiences of the programme. So we will start by kind of introducing to you what is our methodology that we've used, what data collection tools have we used, how have we gathered this data from children. We'll share some key learnings from across the case studies, and then we will look a little bit more in depth at kind of two of the case studies, which are really interesting because they provide a bit of a contrast of these two cases. And then we'll finish with some key takeaways at the end. So thank you again for coming along. As Sophie said, we'll have time for questions at the end, but do share anything in the chat as we go along, and then we'll kind of collate it and come back to anything at the end. Fantastic. So we're going to start by just introducing the children's voice methodology, how and why we developed it. So I will hand over to Chenge, who will talk us through the introduction.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm just going to start by introducing the methodology and explain why we developed it. So we collect a lot of impact data already through numbers and through adult perspectives, so from teachers, volunteers, and parents. But this piece of work was about understanding what it actually feels like for a child to take part in a program and how they describe their experience and the changes in their own words. We developed this approach in partnership with another children's reading charity, Chapter 1, who were interested in bringing a similar kind of methodology into their work. Together, we worked with a specialist in child-led research, Dr. Yashpia Salima, who supported us to design a method that was both child-friendly and robust, so the insights we gathered would be meaningful and reliable. And from that, we developed what we called a day-in-the-life approach. So what this means in practice is that it's an activity-based approach. So rather than just relying on direct questioning, we use things like drawing, creative prompts, discussion, and observation. So children can express themselves in ways that feel comfortable in an informal environment. Importantly, the children's voices were then complemented by perspectives of their teachers, parents, and volunteers. This was really important as it allowed us to understand the full context around each child's experience and gather authentic, comprehensive, and robust evidence to deepen our understanding of children's experiences. We were particularly interested in understanding how children experience the program, what matters most to them, how reading with their volunteer supports their reading journey, and especially in terms of their reading attitudes and behaviors. We were also really interested in finding out more about the role the volunteer plays in shaping that experience. So how we conducted the project. This was a standalone in-depth project with 4 children on the program. Ahead of the visit, each child received what we called a reading research box that they could take home. This included a set of creative prompts to help them reflect on things like what they enjoy reading and what reading means to them. The box was designed to give children different ways to express themselves, so not just through talking, but also through activities like drawing, writing, and using, for example, Play-Doh. We didn't set any expectations for how much they should complete or what they should do with the prompts in the box. Some children did a lot, some did very little, but it worked really well as an icebreaker and gave us something to explore together on the day of our visit. When we visited the school, we spent time one-to-one with each child, using the activities in their box to guide the conversation. We also observed them in school, for example, how they engaged with books in the library or in other reading spaces. And then each case study also included an interview with the child's teacher, parent, and volunteer. Overall, this gave us rich, detailed insights and allowed us to build a rounded picture of each child. So not just their reading ability, but also how they feel about reading and the contexts that shape their experiences. This method provided rich, reliable insights that add an important layer to our evaluation of the one-to-one reading program. I will now hand over to Lisa, who will talk us through what we learned across the 4 case studies.
Thanks, Chengi. So moving on, so what did we learn through the 4 case studies that we conducted? So as Chengi said, we conducted 4 case studies as part of this project. There were 4 children in years 3 and 4. For this presentation, we've kind of anonymized their names to keep them confidential, and these are not their actual pictures. So we're calling them Aisha, Lily, Noah, and Ezra for this presentation. And so there were kind of 2 really key findings that stood out to us at a top level. The first one is really how different each child's journey was. When we kind of looked at all the data that we gathered, when we looked at their starting points, the reasons that they were on the programme, their experiences of the sessions, and kind of how reading with their volunteer had supported their reading, it really varied quite notably from child to child. But despite that, and kind of the second really important finding is that across all 4 of these very different cases, there was really clear evidence of impact. So what varied? As I mentioned, there was a real kind of mix of contexts across the 4 children. The first is the reasons why the children were selected for the programme. So all 4 were on the programme for different reasons. Some had kind of clear barriers in their confidence, another had difficulty kind of focusing on reading and in lessons. There were some children that kind of appeared to be good readers, but then really didn't have regular opportunities to read with an adult at home or at school. Some children already enjoyed reading, others not so much. There was one kind of consistent factor across all 4 children, and this was that they were all reading slightly below their expected standard and needed to do kind of some catching up to get to their level that they need to be at for their reading in school. But in every kind of case, the teachers had identified a need for support, even when it wasn't always immediately obvious in talking to the child. And so, yeah, so kind of their home contexts varied quite a lot, and the support that was available to them at home. For some children, they had kind of busy family lives or other needs in their family that meant there just wasn't that opportunity for shared reading at home. So in those cases, the programme wasn't just there to be kind of additional support, it was effectively filling a gap and making sure that the children had that one-to-one reading time that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And we know that without that reading time, they would then kind of become at risk of falling further behind in their reading development. There were really different personalities and kind of starting attitudes to reading. Some of the children that we worked with were very expressive, very reflective. They could give kind of really detailed reflections on their experience, whereas others, were more quiet, they were quite reserved. Some, as I said, really enjoyed reading. Others were quite reluctant readers or disengaged, just didn't have the confidence. Really importantly, we did find the children were honest about their experiences. They did tell us kind of the things they did and didn't like. For example, they could tell us, what they did enjoy about the sessions, but then also tell us they don't like missing PE, or there were some of the books that they've read that they didn't enjoy so much. And we really felt like that honesty was really valuable because it gave us quite a realistic and balanced picture of what the experience feels like for them. And the final kind of key difference was the different session conditions from program to program. So the delivery of the sessions did really vary across the cases. In some instances, kind of the volunteers told us that the sessions were quite smooth and consistent, and in others, the volunteers that we interviewed told us that there were challenges, such as disruption, inconsistency, or maybe practical issues that affected how the sessions ran, or having difficulties supporting the children to maintain focus. So the experience of delivering the sessions wasn't the same in every case for the volunteers. So those are kind of the key variations and differences. Now we will have a look at what was consistent across the 4 children's case studies. So kind of the first really key finding that was consistent is that despite all of the variation, there was really clear evidence of impact in every case. Firstly, and I think this is really key, is that we found that all of the children were able to explain clearly how their reading with their volunteer has helped and supported them. And we've got kind of some quotes from each of the 4 children here on the screen, that kind of say in their own words how they feel that their volunteer has helped them. So whether that was making them better at reading week by week, helping with difficult words in the moment, making reading fun, where they haven't usually found it fun, or kind of building their confidence to read independently. So I'll just pause on this slide for a moment so you can have a chance to read the quotes from the children. And so this was kind of really key to understanding, and to the purpose of this research, it was kind of understanding how the children articulate what reading with their volunteer, how it's helped them. And so this was kind of a really great key finding to have, that all of the 4 children were able to clearly explain this in their own words and in their own way. Kind of to support this, and in addition, all 4 of the children's teachers also saw really clear day-to-day impact. So we interviewed, as Chenge said, the 4 children's teachers as well. All 4 of them could consistently describe clear changes in reading attitudes, behaviours, and skills. And what we found was, because teachers see the children day to day and kind of see them in their classroom environment, engaging in different types of activities, they were often able to, or in all cases, they were able to describe those changes kind of over time, and often describe things that wouldn't necessarily be visible in a single session. So again, I'll just pause here to give you time to read the quotes from each of the children's teachers. And so then, thinking kind of beyond school as well, we also interviewed parents of the 4 children. And what we saw that in 2 of the cases, we saw those changes really extend beyond the school as well, with the parents being able to describe how the children's attitudes, behaviours towards reading have also changed at home, and them seeing the differences in that. So with children reading more frequently, more independently, talking about reading, talking about books more at home. And kind of the final thing that was really consistent across all of the 4 children was that they told us that they enjoy reading with their volunteers. And that came out kind of really strongly from all 4 of the children. They could all articulate things that they found fun or enjoyable about their sessions, which we know is really key to kind of the purpose of this time that you as volunteers spend with your readers. So kind of to summarize this section and these kind of consistent findings, despite the wide range of contexts and the different session conditions, the really consistent theme was that this dedicated one-to-one time with an adult made a difference in some way for every child. That's really important, because obviously every child came into the programme with very different needs. Their sessions didn't always look the same, but in every case there was really clear evidence of the benefit for all 4 of the children. And so building on that, we have some kind of more detailed insights. And so I'm just going to take you through a few other kind of patterns and detailed findings that we had that came across the 4 cases and the 4 children. The first thing that we learned from these 4 case studies is that there isn't really a typical journey for the children on the programme. And I think this stood out as we were kind of going through all of the data that we'd collected across the 4. Whilst there was one of the children who we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later in the presentation, who had kind of a linear journey where her story was more around kind of she had a clear barrier or challenge that she was facing. Reading with her volunteer provided, really specific support that addressed that barrier. And then there was a really visible change around that challenge. This was the case for one of the children, but actually more commonly, the impact was quite mixed, quite gradual. It didn't really follow a single predictable pattern across the children. And across the interviews with children, parents, teachers, and volunteers, there were a really kind of wide range of changes that were reported. And as I said, they didn't happen in the same way for every child. But when you look at them all together, it shows this really consistent pattern of progress for the children. And so broadly, these changes kind of fall into a few key areas. But importantly, they are really in line with the evidence that we've collected over a number of years at Bookmark about the impact the one-to-one reading programme has for children. And so it was very validating to see this kind of reflected through these 4 case studies as well. So some of the examples of changes reported by the children, teachers and parents included, for example, becoming more confident, such as a child putting their hand up more in class, children saying that they're enjoying reading in their sessions where they might not have said that previously or engaged much with reading at all in the past. Behaviours such as coming into school in the morning and picking up a book and sitting down to read. Reading more frequently at home. The quote on the bottom right is from a teacher talking about how the child's reading mileage, the kind of completion of their reading has really gone up, doing their weekly reads, bringing their journal in and kind of proudly showing it. Other key changes that were reported were differences in reading behaviours. So things like going to the library and feeling confident to engage and go and pick out a book. Having better awareness of their own reading preferences, for example, knowing how they would choose a book, which books they like to choose and how they would pick one. Their reading skills and the way that they kind of approach reading aloud, being able to attempt difficult words, pause, take a moment and try it, whereas previously the child would have just skipped over and kind of avoided anything that was difficult. And improved engagement in the classroom. So being able to engage better in their lessons more broadly, especially around things like answering questions in their lessons, and teachers really noticing the difference in how that's translating in the classroom. So again, these changes didn't all happen for all of the children and not all in the same way. And for 3 of the children, the impact was less of a kind of transformational journey, and it was more of a subtle kind of noticing of changes in behaviours and differences in how they read and engage in reading, and showing up in these kind of small shifts in their everyday behaviour around reading. And so one of the main examples of the children that this is true for is one of our case study children, Ezra. And so this case kind of really illustrates how the impact can be quite subtle, but still really important. So one of our children, Ezra, who we worked with, was kind of a more quiet, less chatty child, quite enjoys reading, but was put on the programme because of his situation at home. And he told us he mostly reads independently at home and without support. And his teacher kind of said that due to his family context, it's difficult for his family to find time to read together. And so when Ezra described what was important to him about his sessions, he focused on quite simple but quite important elements of reading with his volunteer. So the first thing was the regularity of the sessions. He told us that his sessions are Monday and Thursday every week. He told us about the experience of the sessions, that they were enjoyable because this is the time that he gets to read. He told us about the support that he received from his volunteer, in particular, the way that the volunteer helps him with the words that are hard. And the attentiveness of the volunteer is something that he noticed, which is that when he struggles, the volunteer notices straight away. And so kind of in Ezra's case, he wasn't overly detailed or overly emotive, but he described the impact in kind of clear terms that matter to him around this consistent, protected time to read, support from an adult, a role model who could provide that kind of attentive support in the moment, and having that space where he feels supported, and when he's struggling, someone notices. Which kind of brings us on to another key finding from this work, which is around this one-to-one time in itself. And so even when there wasn't this kind of clear, dramatic before and after story for a child, what was really clear is that what matters is this one-to-one time to read with the dedicated adult, the consistent attention and support that's focused on them as a reader is really valuable. And this is especially true when it's not always available in school. And so one of the teachers that we interviewed kind of put this really clearly, as you can see from the quote here on the screen, that they would really love to have, every child having that dedicated reading time, but it just isn't feasible in their school context. And so knowing that children get that regular, consistent one-to-one dedicated time is really valuable to them as a school. We also found that the impact for children doesn't necessarily rely on a single type of kind of strong relationship as such. It comes from this responsive, consistent, and safe support. So the kind of relationship between the child and volunteer is important, but it didn't look the same in every case. And so in Ezra's example that we looked at, it was kind of that consistency, the dedicated time, that safe environment to be supported with mistakes. Whereas some of the other children, Lily and Aisha, were kind of they were a bit more detailed in their responses. They kind of opened up and described the relationship in a bit more kind of warm and expressive terms. Whereas others reflected on the more subtle regularity, consistent, knowing help was available. Which suggests that the connection doesn't always seem to be or need to be highly visible or kind of immediate, or a single type of strong bond in the sessions. But it was the importance was on the fact that the support felt responsive, consistent, and safe. And so this can kind of also show up through, more quiet elements of support, and be embedded more in the structure of the sessions and in the routine of the sessions. Another key finding that we had is that sessions can feel challenging to volunteers and still be impactful. And so kind of across the 4 case studies, what we saw was that how the session feels from a volunteer perspective didn't always match the description of how the child said that they experienced the sessions. And also that it doesn't always reflect the impact that the sessions are having. So there were 2 cases in particular where, although the children reported kind of positive, enjoyable experiences, and that the teachers were really confident in the impact that the sessions were making, the volunteers that we interviewed in those cases were more uncertain about the impact of the sessions, felt that they were a bit more challenging, perhaps because of focus, because of the behaviour of the children, or in some cases practical issues like the technology. And so those challenges are very real for the volunteers and really shape what the session feels like from the volunteer side. But what we saw is that kind of what was interesting is that the children didn't mention those challenges, and their kind of responses focused more on that experience of being supported, listened to, and spending time reading together, which is really reassuring as it suggests that the session can feel challenging to deliver, and still be meaningful for the child. But I think just as a side note here, also just to say that if you do kind of experience a more difficult programme and feel concerned about its impact, I think that's a really good time to kind of get in touch with the volunteers team, and Sophie and the team are really happy to kind of support and work with the school and with our volunteers to explore the solutions in those cases. but it was really reassuring to see kind of the children's perceptions of the impact of those sessions that were challenging to deliver for the volunteers. And another important insight from this work is that volunteers often underestimate the impact that they're having. So, which kind of links to what we've just said. In many cases, we saw that really strong evidence of meaningful changes, particularly from the teachers and the parents, but these were not always visible within the sessions or in the moment. And so this tells us that the impact can take many forms and is not necessarily always easy to spot in the moment. And also demonstrated to us the need to kind of continue to help volunteers recognise the different forms of impact that they're having, especially as Sophie said at the beginning, when partner schools are not always necessarily in a position to be able to provide that individual and consistent feedback for pupils. And so hopefully hearing some of these kind of insights today will help to share some of that really specific impact that reading with children does have. Another really interesting finding that we had, and this is the last one before we look at some of the case studies in more detail, is that the children didn't necessarily feel like reading with their volunteer was being told to read. So in two of the cases, two of the children kind of described quite clearly that being told what to do, being told that it's time to read or that they have to read is really a barrier for them enjoying reading at all or wanting to engage in reading. Two of the children were a bit more strong-willed, a bit more independent. And so for them, this was something that kind of really put them off reading and didn't make it feel fun or enjoyable. Interestingly, neither of those children described their sessions or related that to this idea of being told to read. Both of them kind of talked about the sessions as being fun and enjoyable and feeling different for them than this kind of regular, being told to read in school in their learning or in their lessons. They didn't really relate it to their sessions with their volunteers. Describing the sessions as kind of more informal, more flexible, and led by the child. Some of the elements in particular that they spoke about enjoying or being important in that was were the games and activities, the chance to kind of have informal conversation and chat, the friendly, relaxed approach, and also the choice and the flexibility, like choosing books, stopping and taking breaks. So those were kind of the key overarching insights that we had across the 4 case studies. And so what we'll do now is actually look at 2 of the children in a little bit more detail. And it's quite interesting. The 2 children, I think we chose these ones to share today because they, in a few different ways, are kind of contrasting and show 2 quite different sides of the impact of the sessions. And so the first one is Aisha, and this is the one that I mentioned earlier, where Aisha's impact was very visible. And in many ways, it was quite a kind of transformational story of impact for Aisha. And so Aisha starting with her starting point. So Aisha was a very engaging child. She's very lively. She's very expressive, very active. She's quite independent. She's one of the children that I mentioned that doesn't like being told what to do. And she likes doing things her own way. She told us she doesn't like asking people for help. And her kind of starting point before she joined the programme was very much that she preferred other activities to reading, especially things like playing football. So when it came to reading for Aisha, she's a very confident child, but she didn't have any confidence in her reading ability. Because of that, she didn't engage in family reading time at home. She really avoided reading out loud in her lessons. Her teacher described to us how she would kind of speak very quietly. She would mutter through the words, or just to try and avoid, having to engage in reading tasks altogether. And her volunteer told us, kind of in line with all of this, that in the beginning of the sessions, Aisha just felt like she couldn't read. And she would say to her in the sessions, I can't read, I can't read. So although she's very confident in herself, she didn't see herself as a reader. And this was Aisha's key barrier when she started reading with her volunteer. So moving on to the sessions, I think what's really powerful in Aisha's case is that she could really clearly describe the change that had come about as a result of reading with her volunteer and in her own words. So she explained to us during the interview what reading felt like before reading with her volunteer, that she couldn't do it. And normally when I read by myself, it's like I can't read. And then she was able to explain to us how the sessions felt different and easier for her. And her words were that her volunteer makes easy books for me to read. And she would describe to us how they would read together, that her volunteer reads a paragraph and then that she would read a paragraph, and then that sometimes she would be able to just go on to the next bit by herself. And she described as well how the encouragement from the volunteer and the recognition was what kind of boosted her and motivated her and made her feel like she could do it. So when her volunteer says to her, "Oh, wow," that's when she feels like she can read by herself. And so I think it's really great to be able to kind of hear that in Aisha's own words, how she interprets what it was like before reading with her volunteer and how the sessions really supported her. And so what changed for Aisha as a result of this? Across all of the 4 perspectives, we saw really clear evidence of a shift in Aisha's confidence. She became more willing to try, more willing to keep going, less likely to just avoid reading altogether. Aisha's volunteer described the change when Aisha realised that she could do it, and that this confidence then kind of translated into her wider reading behaviours. So she was, reading more independently, showing better persistence in her reading. And her parent also was able to describe how she had noticed Aisha's reading behaviours changing at home, that now she pauses, takes a moment, corrects herself, rather than skipping and avoiding kind of difficult words, which is what she would have done before. And so we really saw this kind of growing confidence for Aisha as a reader and how this impacted her general engagement with reading. This was visible for the volunteer in the sessions, but it was also visible kind of beyond the sessions. So at home, her parent described how she was reading more independently and that she was beginning to join in with family reading time at home, which she hadn't shown any interest in doing before. And her parent reflected that we've never had a moment like this for Aisha where it's just clicking. And it was also visible to her teacher in school. So as I said, she was kind of more willing to read out loud. She was less likely to avoid the reading, and she was just more confident taking part in those reading activities. And so what supported this change for Aisha? A key part of this was we learned kind of through speaking to Aisha and also through speaking to Aisha's volunteer, was how her volunteer had approached the sessions. So this particular volunteer worked in a very low pressure way with Aisha, really followed her lead, constantly kind of adapted the way of engaging with Aisha based on, Aisha's lead, described their approach as very much led by her. And in Aisha's case, this was kind of really important given her personality, that we know she doesn't really respond well to being told what to do. And she kind of engages more when she has that choice and control. And so that worked really well for Aisha in this case. And so this was a really kind of clear example of quite a transformational journey for a child, starting with that low confidence, and just general avoidance of reading. A really clear change when her confidence increased, and how that kind of unlocked this wider change in Aisha's reading journey, being more persistent, more independent, and just engaging more generally. And so in contrast to Aisha's case, we also wanted to share a slightly different story that, didn't necessarily kind of look as transformational or quite as visible in the moment as Aisha's story. So Chenge is going to talk us through Lily's case study now.
Thank you, Lisa. So Lily's story looked a bit different. So Lily was selected for the program because she wasn't meeting the expected standard in reading. However, unlike Aisha, she was already confident and an expressive child. and the reading ability itself was not the main issue. Instead, the challenge was more around focus, attention, and how she engaged in reading and learning in the classroom. So from the volunteers' perspective, Lily was one of the more challenging children that they had worked with. The sessions felt quite challenging, and they found it difficult to keep Lily focused and sometimes struggled with her behavior and attention. And they felt that the impact was not always very visible in the moment, as you can see from the quote on the slide as well. When we looked across the child, parent, and teacher perspectives, there was a different picture, however. They all described impact in areas such as confidence and emotional response, enjoyment and intrinsic motivation, her reading behaviors, as well as her reading skills and broader learning. For example, Lily described feeling less stressed by her reading. As you can see from her quote here, she feels less stressed about the words, and she doesn't just stop in the middle of a book and then leave it. Now she can just finish a book in a snap of a finger. Her teacher described increased enthusiasm, including asking for new books. And her parent described a shift from needing prompting to read to choosing to read independently. So in Aisha's case, the change was quite visible and immediate. However, in Lily's case, it was a lot more subtle, less linear, and not as obvious during the sessions. I'll now hand back to Lisa to just summarize kind of the key learnings.
Thanks, Chengi. Perfect. So to kind of close the session before we move on to questions, we wanted to bring together kind of the key things that we have learned from engaging the children in this research project, and speaking to the other adults in their reading journeys. So the key thing that we really learned is that every child's journey on the programme is really different. However, across all of these cases, there was really clear evidence of impact. What were the themes that drive that impact? It was the dedicated one-to-one time with an adult. It was consistent, responsive support, and it was the flexible, child-led approach to reading. How the impact showed up, it showed up in many ways, many different ways, from child to child. The key ways we really saw it through this project was the increased confidence and enjoyment, greater motivation to read, better engagement in reading, more independent reading behaviours, and improvements in their reading skills. And so why was this research important? And what did it add to our understanding? I think really importantly, we learned that the children themselves can clearly articulate how the programme and reading with their volunteer supports them. So even when the impact isn't visible straight away, the children can tell us in their words how they've benefited from the time reading with their volunteer. Although these case studies look really different for each child, it's that consistent one-to-one support that helps every child move forward in their reading journey. The different perspectives were really valuable to this because each of them showed a different part of the picture and allowed us to kind of build that full context of the child and really understand their journey as a reader. And again, just really understand how they are kind of changing, moving forward, and where those changes are coming in, and where those bits of impact can be seen across the different perspectives. And so kind of our key takeaway is that even when it's not always visible, the time that you as volunteers are spending with the children is really making a difference. And so those are kind of our key takeaways. And so just to finish with a huge thank you for the impact that you've made. We've really kind of loved conducting this research with the children. It's been such an amazing project, such a fascinating piece of work to be able to really dig into the children's perspectives. But the most amazing thing about it is seeing that impact and seeing the evidence in all of these different ways of how these children's journeys are changing and transforming. So thank you for the impact that you have made. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to our session today.